Okay, so welcome back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club, November 2021 edition. This is one of, I don't know if I call it one of my favorite books, but a really useful book in terms of leadership in some important, very practical dimensions. And it's the unusual book for me that I learned a lot, and the author took me on a journey, and it was just fun to read. It was a fun, informative book. It could be fun because Dan Harris, the guy who wrote this book, is a journalist. He's a TV news guy at ABC News in New York, USA, and reports for the national news. He's from Boston originally, and he is cynical and sarcastic and at times playful and self-deprecating. And when he takes you on a journey, it's a fun, amusing thing. And so I enjoyed being taken on this journey. And the journey is about his exploration of meditation as a tool and how that came to be for him, what triggered him to go on this journey, the steps along the way. And what I'd like to do to introduce the book is to share a video that I found while doing a little research for today. And it's a YouTube clip. It's about 13 minutes. And it's actually a little report that he did on the Nightline news program for ABC News in New York, well, national news in the US. And it talks about his story and what prompted this. He talks about kind of why he wrote this book. And then he talks about a number of things that I was planning to talk about from my review of the book or re-review of the book. But I'll go into a little bit more depth, and this will give you a bit of an overview of his style and let you know a bit of what's coming. Okay, here we go. This is Dan Harris on Nightline.
A story we're calling 10% Happier. We're trying something a little different on Nightline tonight because I'm going to tell you a story about me. Actually, it's not just about me because I found a way to make myself significantly happier, and it could probably work for you too. I stumbled upon this whole thing as a result of a bizarre, unplanned odyssey, and it all started with the most embarrassing day of my life.
From ABC News, this is Good Morning America.
We're going to go now to Dan Harris, who's at the news desk. Dan.
Good morning, Charlie and Diane. Thank you. This is me 10 years ago. And the reason this is the most embarrassing day of my life is not that it looks like I've been attacked by a blow dryer and a can of hairspray. No, it's that I am about to freak out on national television. Health news now, one of the world's most commonly prescribed medications may be providing a big bonus. Researchers report people who take cholesterol-lowering drugs called statins for at least 5 years may also lower their risk for cancer. But it's too early to prescribe statins slowly for cancer production. At this point, I realize I'm helpless, so I bail right in the middle. That does it for news. We're going to go back now to Robin and Charlie. The control room, clearly taken by surprise, continues to roll video for the next story about Harry Potter, which I was no longer able to read.
All right, thanks very much, Dan Harris at the news desk with some of the headlines of the morning. Want to go to Tony Perkins now?
Once the fear subsided, humiliation rushed in. I knew with rock-solid certainty that I had just had a panic attack on national television. So why would I tell you this very embarrassing story? Because that on-air meltdown was the culmination of something that had been building for years, something I never stopped to address. It's something we all battle, whether we have panic attacks or not. Call it the voice in your head. You know the voice I'm talking about. The often nasty inner narrator who discourages and derails you when you're considering going after opportunities in your life. That stew of urges and impulses that has you losing your temper and regretting it later, or putting your hand in the fridge when you're not even hungry. And for many of us, it's that nagging temptation to float off into our own heads instead of actually listening to people.
Kind of caught me and the wife at a bad time.
It's a love story.
My favorite comedian, Dave Chappelle, nailed it on his show.
That's a monkey.
He spins NASCAR race. Unicorns.
In my case, like many Americans, my inner voice was pushing me to succeed. Annual New Year's party in New York. This is me in my late 20s.
Thank you, Dan.
I had my dream job, but I also had doubts about whether I was good enough. But it's hard to do that. All right, I'm going to try it. 3, 2, 1. My solution, become a workaholic. After 9/11, I volunteered to spend years in war zones where I covered the heroics of our men and women overseas and got a real taste of both the horror and the adrenaline of combat. Americans to institute healthcare for millions. Now here I am back home. Practice makes perfect, you know. I may look okay, but the guy you see here, he's having trouble getting out of bed. This tax debate is one of the clearest choices in this election. After years of always barreling forward, when I finally slowed down, it was as if my mind revolted and I got depressed. And so in my free time, I briefly but stupidly began self-medicating, even using cocaine, which my doctor would later tell me almost certainly produced that on-air panic attack. That realization that I'd been blindly letting my urges and impulses yank me around became a turning point. Eventually, I would find the antidote to this kind of mindlessness, something that would, to quote the somewhat tongue-in-cheek title of a new book I've written, make me 10% happier. But to get there, a few other things had to happen.
We're going to take a closer look tonight at the continuing battle about teaching evolution.
Coincidentally, it was around this time that my boss, Peter Jennings, assigned me to cover the religion beat. To be candid, I was not initially super interested in the subject. This was the last time I read scripture, my bar mitzvah. But here I am, nice to meet you, among the believers, going to mega churches, mosques, and Mormon temples. So I made real friendship.
Each of us could learn something from the other.
And developed a newfound and lasting respect for the value of having a view of the world that's larger than just yourself. However, none of what I encountered spoke to me personally. That all changed, though, when one of my colleagues recommended I check out this rather odd little man.
Welcome.
The best-selling, Oprah-approved self-help guru Eckhart Tolle.
Alertness arises.
Yes.
Which is different from thinking.
Tolle was the first person I ever heard talk about the voice in the head, which he says is so busy obsessing about the past or the future that you miss what's happening right now and make stupid decisions, like I had done when I got depressed and self-medicated with drugs. So I decided I need to meet this guy. Do you stop thinking? How do you stop the voice in your head?
You create little spaces in your daily life where you are aware, but not thinking. For example, you take one conscious breath.
Unbreak my heart, Tolle. That's all the practical advice you've got? I can hear the cynics in the audience saying, guys saying I can, awaken by taking a deep breath. What is he talking about?
Yes, that's the mind talking. So and of course, many people will have their mind commenting on what I'm saying and saying, well, that is useless.
That was exactly what my mind was saying. Don't you ever get pissed off, annoyed, irritated, sad, anything negative?
No, I accept what is. And that's why life has become so simple.
Well, somebody cuts you off in your car?
It's fine. It's like a sudden gust of wind. I don't personalize a gust of wind. And so it's simply what is.
And you're able to enjoy every moment, even if I start asking you a ton of annoying questions.
Yes, that would be fine. So it's really...
Don't tempt me. I walked out of the interview deeply confused by Tolle, but still very much intrigued by the notion of defanging the voice in my head. As it happened, just a few weeks later, I was moderating a debate for Nightline, and one of the guests was Deepak Chopra, the inspiration for the movie The Love Guru.
My goal is to get you to say, gee, you are you, TM.
I couldn't resist whipping out my little camera to ask if he had any practical advice. So your mind doesn't wander? You don't find yourself thinking about things that are in the past or in the future as opposed to in the present?
I have no regrets about the past. I do not hold resentments or grievances that come from the past, and I don't anticipate the future. I live in the moment.
Okay, so what if the moment is horrible? What if you really have to go to the bathroom and there's no toilet nearby? Or what if you're super hungry and there's no food?
I separate myself from the situation surrounding the moment. The moment is always free. It's the transformational vortex to the infinite.
Apparently, when one lives in the moment, one becomes unafraid to use terms like transformational vortex to the infinite. With Deepak not making any sense to me, I decided to dive further into America's self-help subculture, where things only got weirder.
Do you want to be a millionaire?
What kind of a business you want to have?
I met a gaggle of gurus, many of whom featured prominently in the best-selling book and DVD, The Secret. And their advice for dealing with the voice in my head was to force myself to do more positive thinking, which they promised could get me
Anything you want.
This is Joe Vitale, who charges $5,000 for a ride in his Rolls Royce.
Well, there are people who think I should charge a lot more than that. They think that's giving it away.
And who, in this interview, as you're about to see, folds like a cheap lawn chair. So what if I want a thing? A diamond necklace for my wife. I can get that by thinking about it?
Not just thinking about it. That's one of the biggest misconceptions of all time. You have to take action.
Isn't that a statement of the glaringly obvious? You think it's news to most people that if you want something, you have to want it and then try to get it?
You know, when you put it that way, it sounds silly and actually, pretty brainless.
After listening to me yammer on about all of this for months, my then fiancée, Bianca, who's a doctor, decided to intervene. She started giving me books to read. Books that made me realize that all this stuff about the voice in the head and being in the moment, these are ideas that people have been talking about for centuries. From the Buddha to Sigmund Freud to Coach Taylor from Friday Night Lights.
So I suggest you wake up, get your heads in this game.
I read tons of these books, stacks of them. And it was through these books that I finally found something that actually does work. It's simple, scientifically tested, and completely free. Problem was, it sounded totally unacceptable to me. Up next, what I found at the end of my long, strange journey. It's the secret to success for everyone from executives to pro athletes, even Marines. It's been shown to rewire your brain for happiness. How I got there and how you can too when Nightline continues.
Okay, part 2 coming up right here.
Welcome back. Not long ago, I found myself on a strange, unplanned journey. It started with an on-air panic attack and led to interviews with a gaggle of gurus, none of whom could give me any practical, actionable advice for taming the voice in my head. Until finally, I stumbled upon the last thing I ever would have expected: meditation. I always assumed meditation was for people who like crystals, incense, and John Tesh music. In other words, there was no way I was going to meditate. But then I heard about scientific studies showing that meditation can, among other things, lower your blood pressure and boost your immune system. And then I learned that meditation does not necessarily involve wearing robes, lighting incense, or believing in anything in particular. People of any faith or no faith can do it. In fact, it's totally straightforward. There are basically just 3 steps. Number 1, sit upright. Doesn't have to be cross-legged. You can do it in a chair, on the floor, whatever. 2, just try to feel your breath coming in and going out. And 3, whenever your mind wanders, which it will a million times, simply return your attention to the breath. So one day after I learned all of this, I very reluctantly gave it a shot. Breathe in. What kind of bird was Big Bird? Breathe out. Do I need a haircut? What's the definition? I decided pencil should be yellow. In a way, it was like the panic attack. My mind hurling lots of crazy thoughts at me. Idea for old school hip-hop vegetable. Rap Van Winkle. Why? But this time, I had a weapon. Get in the game, dude. In those brief moments where I was simply focused on my breath, breathe in, breathe out. It was like pressing the mute button on the voice in my head. Where did gerbils run wild? Breathe out. But I describe myself as more of a baller or a shot. Breathe out. And it created space between the thoughts before they inevitably came marauding back in. Meditation is like exercise for your brain. I'm not speaking metaphorically here. Check this out. Brain scans show that short daily doses of meditation literally grow the gray matter in areas associated with self-awareness and compassion and shrink the area associated with stress. As for me, it's not like my life has become a nonstop parade of rainbows and unicorns. I still sometimes let work stress me out and distract me, but my emotions and impulses no longer yank me around as much, which, frankly, is a superpower. Meditation has also helped me slow down enough that the good stuff in my life has become much more vivid, from the fact that ABC lets me be the co-anchor of Nightline to simply eating cookies with my wife or playing with our cats. An important point here. It is possible to get happier in this way without going soft. These Marines here are part of an experiment to see if meditation makes more resilient warriors. The first time they said to you, we're going to teach you how to meditate, what was your gut reaction?
This is going to be absolutely ridiculous.
Corporate executives are using it too. Even the lead singer of Weezer, who told me meditation helped him cure crippling stage fright.
It's about eight years ago, I started practicing 2 hours every day. And at first, the unpleasantness got worse before I was going on stage. And I was wondering, is this really working? But I stuck with it. And now I feel so much calmer.
And check out this list of other conditions meditation has been shown to be good for. There are no miracle cures, despite what you hear from the self-help gurus. I like to say meditation has made me roughly 10% happier. If it can work for a fidgety, skeptical newsman, maybe you too should give it a shot. We are going to turn to a story we're calling...
Okay. Therein is an overview of Dan Harris's journey, from the famous meltdown on the air to his invitation to be the religion reporter for ABC News, and thereby interviewing a number of people, including Eckhart Tolle and Deepak Chopra. And he left out a couple of other important chunks from that journey, which are covered in his book. He did show a cover of the book, which is this. The full title is 10% Happier: How I Tamed the Voice in My Head, Reduced Stress Without Losing My Edge, and Found Self-Help That Actually Works, a True Story. You get a sense of what his tone is, even in the title of the book. So let's go through the book quickly. It's only got, I think, 10 or 11 chapters within an important appendix. And along the way, I want to highlight some portions of his journey and some parts which I think are really the most practical from a leadership point of view, a personal leadership point of view. And that's really what this is about, is how does this notion of this type of exploration and how do the practical applications of what he's writing about really support us to be better, to be happier. He says 10% happier in the book. He even in the epilogue, he talks about how it's really been much more than 10%, but you always want to underpromise and over-deliver. In the preface of the book, which is really a great preview of the whole book, he starts the book with, I think you just get a sense of what you're in for. And I'll read this. I initially wanted to call this book "The Voice in My Head is an Asshole." However, the title was deemed inappropriate for a man whose day job requires him to abide by FCC, Federal Communications Commission decency standards. So there you go. And I'm looking down at my notes here if you see me looking in this direction. So he goes from being completely ignorant about mindfulness to being incredibly skeptical and suspicious, and then genuinely questioning some of what he's learning, as you'll hear in some of the portions that I'm reading from and some of the references, and questioning the people who are delivering the messages, and all that experimenting and sharing, cynically expressed, but honestly written about, is shared and takes you on this journey. So chapter 1 of the book is called Air Hunger. And he talks about this notion, he talks about having a panic attack, and this notion of air hunger is when you literally can't breathe in a sense of a panic attack. And he talks about his meltdown on the air, as well as his background, tells you a little bit about how he got into the news business and his personality, and sets the stage or sets a tone for the need for this type of support or relief for himself. As he says, my modus operandi was inherited from my father, whose motto was, the price of security is insecurity. And he describes himself as a very insecure and worried young man. He said his younger brother once said that Dan makes Woody Allen look like a Buddhist monk. And he said, straight from childhood, I was a frequent mental inventory taker, scanning my consciousness for objects of concern, kind of like pressing a bruise to see if it still hurts. And it was interesting. He had this way of putting it. He said, I was keenly aware that while this kind of insecurity may prolong my life, right? Insecurity, looking for threats, and the brain is wired to focus on concerns and challenges because that's what keeps us alive. I was keenly aware that this kind of insecurity may prolong life, but it also made it less enjoyable. A few weeks after 9/11, he was asked to go to Pakistan and report on the war there. And he said a pint of dopamine was released into my brain. He described this as journalistic heroin, the pure sick rush of being somewhere in the world you're not supposed to be, and not only getting away with it, but getting on TV. And that fed his ego. And he often talks about his ego and how being a newsman requires you to have a serious ego, to be competitive, to be hard driving, and that's what helped him be successful. And what was the consequence of that, which is what the book often talks about. He came back from the Middle East and was diagnosed with depression, manifesting in a number of physical symptoms. And he said the doctor recommended antidepressants, but by that point, he had already begun self-medicating. And then he discusses that well-known meltdown. You saw pieces of that in the video. And he said it happened again a second time. The first time, he said people were very concerned about him. And he said he was actually surprised on some level that there weren't graver consequences to him for having that situation. And but he said the people around him were very supportive. He said it happened a second time. And as part of his healing, he went to a psychiatrist who told him to get off drugs. And he said to himself, psychotherapy seems like a reasonable route. This is what people like me did when things get rough, right? I mean, even Tony Soprano had a therapist. He said the therapist told him to get off drugs, which ultimately he did fairly quickly, was able to get off the drugs, thankfully. Chapter 2 talks about his experience as a religion correspondent for the news, ABC News, as he talked about in that video there, that ABC News anchor and leader Peter Jennings told him to get into this space. He began covering a pastor in Colorado named Pastor Ted Haggard, who later crashed in a gay sex scandal. So this testimony started to come out, these recordings started to come out. And importantly in that chapter, and Harris alluded to this in the video that we saw, he said that in covering people of faith, he learned to see that there was a value in focusing on something broader than yourself. So even though he's a very self-professed atheist, he recognized the value in believing in something larger than ourselves. And he referenced how Pastor Ted, as this gentleman's called, never lost his faith, even when everything came crashing down around him as a result of this scandal that he got himself into. He said as a result of this covering the religion beat, as he called it, he learned the value of a viewpoint that transcended the mundane, or as he put it in the book, I realized that if you're never looking up, you're always just looking around, which I thought was a very interesting take about faith. Chapter 3 begins to talk about his meeting Eckhart Tolle, as he described in the video as well. A colleague of mine recommended that he read this book. He said, Tolle began to unfurl a fascinating thesis, one that made me think he must have somehow spent an enormous amount of time inside my skull. Our entire lives are governed by a voice in our heads. That voice is constantly charging ahead and labeling everything in its field of vision. Its targets aren't external only. It often viciously applies towards us too. The inner ego is our narrator and our sense of I. So that inner critic is really what prompted Harris to go on this whole journey, is how do I work with that inner critic? And I know in my coaching work, that is a very common malady that successful people, not just in business, but elsewhere, face, is they have this hard driving, judging inner critic. This, in fact, is something that I've been learning more about through an approach called positive intelligence, which is related to positive psychology and this notion that inside of us we have these saboteurs, which are largely a function of judging mental patterns that come from childhood. I won't get into that too much. He said, I suppose I always assumed that the voice in my head was me. The ego is simply an internal anchor man hosting the coverage of my life, engaged in an unsolicited stream of insensitive questions and obnoxious color commentary. But then he says, as Eckhart Tolle argued, the ego thrives on drama and comparisons, never being satisfied. He said, perhaps the most Tollean insight into the ego was that it's obsessed with the past and the future at the expense of the present. And Harris talks about he had always been avoiding the present. He said the unspoken assumption and most of my forward momentum was based on the notion that whatever was coming next would definitely be better. So being restless, not being satisfied with what is happening now, thinking ahead, or ruminating on the past. And that's the trap that Tolle was talking about. And that's what Dan Harris was trying to get to. What could I do with this? And he said, it was a little embarrassing to be reading a self-help writer and thinking, this guy gets me. But it was in this moment, lying in bed late at night, that I first realized that the voice in my head, the running commentary that dominated my field of consciousness since I can remember, was kind of an asshole. But he also acknowledged that a lot of what Tolle said, both in his books and also in interviews, was a little wacky, like this notion of never being upset, never anything bothering him, and a bunch of things about energy fields that Harris was really having none of. He was not remotely any sort of new age guy, and it totally put him off. And he said, I honestly can't figure out if he was a genius or a lunatic. But he recognized, as he started to read some of this material and think about it some more, he started to recognize what value it might have. For example, he tells a story of being in the doctor's office with a basal cell carcinoma, a skin thing on his cheek just below his eye. And the doctor said that she needed to cut into his skin a few times to be sure that all the problem skin cells were removed. And at one point in the conversation, when he said, what's the worst case scenario? She said he could potentially be blinded, because if the skin problems went up into his eye or behind his eye, he could be blinded. And he said, I could feel my heartbeat accelerate and the terrible fear racing through my mind. And he said, then I realized that these fearful forecasts, as he said, these fearful forecasts were just thoughts skittering through my mind. And what made it different is I realized that they were just thoughts. They were not what was really happening. So through some of this reading, he started to question his own thinking, which is a huge, huge leadership competency in my view, and personal development competency. Can we question our own thinking? Tolle was forcing me to confront the fact that the thing I'd always thought was my greatest asset, my internal cattle prod, was also perhaps my greatest liability. I was now genuinely questioning my own personal orthodoxy, which had been my personal operating thesis since like age 8. And so he also writes about the interview that he had with Eckhart Tolle, with some of which you saw in the video, where he said, so you never get upset, even if I ask you obnoxious questions. He had the interview, and then he concluded, and he writes about this, Tolle had opened up something in me, a window into the enfeebling clamor of the ego, but he still hadn't answered my most pressing questions. How do you tame the voice in the head? How do you actually tame it? Not just recognize how it works, which is almost like uncovering this problem without any type of solution. How do you stay in the now? And as he put it, was it really possible to defeat the gray Stalinism of self-absorption without ending up on a park bench? Again, he's alluding here to, how can I really look at this without completely losing my edge and just freaking out and losing touch with reality? Because his grasp of reality was largely identifying with his inner critic. Chapter 4 is about meeting Deepak Chopra. And Harris writes, Eckhart was befuddling because while I believed he was sincere, I couldn't tell if he was sane. With Deepak, it was the opposite. I believed he was sane, but I couldn't tell if he was sincere. And he was very suspicious of Chopra's empire of spas and products, and his willingness to just be, this is my term, not Harris's, kind of media seeking and attention seeking. He also remained curious, Harris did, and started to get into exploring a lot of the self-help movement. He talks about in the video clip we just saw there about meeting some of the people who were involved in the film The Secret, including the Rolls-Royce trip with Joe Vitale. He also met James Arthur Ray, another man who was featured in that film, and wasn't particularly impressed with him either. And James Arthur Ray then famously was presiding over a sweat lodge in Sedona, in which several people died, and that took him off the screen completely. Then we get to a portion of the book that's very, very important that he didn't talk about in this video, and that was his relationship with a writer, a psychiatrist in New York, and a writer of books about Buddhism named Mark Epstein. And this is one of the people that Harris labels as a Jubu, because he said there's a number of people who are American Buddhist scholars and writers who were Jewish, and he refers to them as Jubus. He said, He learned about Mark Epstein and these books about Buddhism. These were the books that his wife recommended to him, as he described in the video. And he started to read these books, which he described as very satisfying. And he said 2.5 millennia before Eckhart Tolle started cashing his royalty checks, it was the Buddha who originally came up with a brilliant diagnosis of the way the mind works. The route to true happiness was to achieve a visceral understanding of impermanence, which will take you off the emotional roller coaster and allow you to see your dramas and desires through a wider lens. And Harris was particularly taken with this expression, monkey mind. He said, my favorite Buddhist catchphrase was the one they used to describe the churning of the ego. Monkey mind. Our minds are like funny little gibbons, always agitated, never at rest. And he thought again, he still struggled with the idea of relaxing and letting go and how appealing that was. But for him, that equated to passivity. So losing my edge. If I let go and I get out of my ego or my internal cattle prod, as he described it, then he says, will I lose my edge if I practice Buddhism? Doesn't competitive serve a useful purpose? I found this really interesting because I could relate to that as well. Yeah, there's something positive about pushing ourselves to success. And when we work with people and coach people, particularly in leadership positions, who are successful, whatever that means, they've often achieved because they push themselves to achieve through this inner critic that keeps pushing them ahead. We talked a couple of months ago about Arianna Huffington's book, Thrive, and this notion of money and power and the drive for success and some of the very negative consequences that can result from overdoing it. And Harris is talking about this from another way and really directly addressing and disempowering that inner critic, which is what we're getting to. He said he had some positive experiences on his honeymoon. He said that he was able to savor some things while they lasted, take deliberate pauses. He describes again through the book, you're on his journey, things are starting to pay off a little bit. And he said when he met Mark Epstein, he said, it hit me that what I had on my hands here was a previously undiscovered species, a normal human being, as opposed to some of the other self-help people and Eckhart Tolle and some of these folks he couldn't relate to. And Epstein proposed meditation to Harris, but he wasn't at all ready, just like he said in the video. It was not something I was going to do. The Buddhists had an actual practical program. It was a radical internal jujitsu move that was supposed to allow you to face the asshole in your head directly and peacefully disarm him. The problem was I found what they were proposing to be repellent. That was his term. Chapter 6 is called The Power of Negative Thinking, and it talks a lot about what he learned about Buddhism. And again, that he had no interest in meditating. But while on holiday with some friends, he decided to try it. And he describes the experience he had with these different ideas popping into his head, much like what was described in the video there with these different things popping up all around him. He said, when I opened my eyes, I had an entirely different attitude about meditation. I didn't like it, but I respected it. It was a rigorous brain exercise. The repeated attempt to bring the compulsive thought machine to heel was like holding a live fish in your hands. Wrestling your mind to the ground, repeatedly hauling your attention back to the breath in the face of the inner onslaught required genuine grit. This was a badass endeavor, and I resolved to do it every day. And he says, unlike Tolle, who offered very little by way of actionable advice, meditation presented a real remedy, a temporary escape route from the clammy embrace of self-obsession. It may have been miserable, but it was the best and only solution I had heard yet. So he talks about beginning to use things like a breath exercise to jolt himself back to the present, which helped him in airport lines and waiting and being stuck in traffic. He said, meditation was radically altering my relationship to boredom, something I've spent my whole life scrambling to avoid. I started to see that life's in-between moments, sitting at a red light, waiting for my crew to set up for an interview, these were a chance to focus on my breath or just take in my surroundings. As soon as I began playing this game, I really noticed how much sleepwalking I did and how powerfully my mind propelled me forward or backward. He said the net effect of meditation was striking. It was like anchoring myself to an underground aquifer of calm. It became a way to steel myself as I moved through the world. He describes more about what he learned about Buddhism. I'm not going to read all of this. And another instruction in some of the books of what some of these teachers call noting. So just noting things as they were happening, which he described as applying a soft mental label to what was coming up in his head. He could label it and therefore distance himself from it. Yeah. He says the Buddhists say the only way out is through. For example, he says, like, when a big wave is coming, the best way to not get pummeled is to dive right in, dive right through it, face that fear, face that anxiety that comes up here. So he quotes Mark Epstein speaking at a Buddhist conference, and Epstein said, people come to me a lot feeling like they ought to be loving themselves, and I actually counsel against it. He said, mindfulness gives us a way to examine our self-hatred without trying to make it go away. So stay away from all of the positive thinking spin and face what's actually happening. And again, he makes this distinction between mindfulness, including the way the Buddhists described it, the Buddhist writings anyway, and the self-help stuff that he talks about even in the video that we just saw a few minutes ago. He heard at the same Buddhist conference from Tara Brach, who is a meditation instructor. Her videos are all over the internet. And she talked about the acronym RAIN as an approach to mindfulness. R for recognize what's happening, A for allow it, I for investigate it, and N, non-identification, don't identify with it. He said he tried it and it was like a revelation. The voice in my head, which I'd always taken so seriously, suddenly lost much of its authority. Not only did it ease my agita in the moment, but it suddenly imbued me with hope about better handling whatever garbage my ego was going to cough up going forward. And very importantly, he talks about something he learned from Mark Epstein, who said, seeing a problem clearly doesn't prevent you from taking action. He said, acceptance is not passivity. So to create distance in our thoughts, to see something from a distance, doesn't mean to remove ourselves from taking action with respect to that. Acceptance is not passivity. What mindfulness does is create some space in your head so you can respond rather than simply react. Something that comes up very often in the executive coaching that we do. In the Buddhist view, you can't control what comes up in your head. It all arises out of a mysterious void. The only thing you can control is how you handle it, which Harris described as, this is the whole ball of wax. Chapter 7 is sort of a bit of a crescendo piece, because in chapter 7, he goes on a 10-day silent retreat with another one of these Buju teachers named Joseph Goldstein, a very prominent meditation teacher in the US. And he describes the whole experience, which at times is really hysterical, about the discomfort of sitting on pillows and comments about the food and these crazy judgments about these different people he's seeing, and just about the whole experience being awkward and weird. Just descriptions about his back, and it was painful to sit so long, judging what was coming up in his mind, feeling stupid. And then he said something clicked after a couple of days. After trying to, as he said, after trying to tune into a specific radio frequency, I finally found the right setting. I just started letting my focus fall on whatever is the most prominent thing in my field of consciousness, just paying attention to whatever was coming up without judging it, just paying attention, whatever it was. He says the real superpower of meditation is not just to manage your ego more mindfully, but to see that the ego itself has no actual substance. If you close your eyes and look for it, you won't find any self that you can put your finger on. So again, this sense of separation from our thoughts. On day 9 of the retreat, so it was a 10-day retreat. On day 9, he had a chance to have some conversation with this teacher, Joseph Goldstein. And Harris asked the question, how can you advise us not to worry about the things we have to do in the world? If I miss my plane, that's a genuine problem. How could you tell us that we shouldn't be thinking about these things? And Goldstein said, fair enough, but when you find yourself running through your trip to the airport in your head for the 17th time, ask yourself the following question: is this useful? And he said that was just like a gong going off in his head, is what Harris writes about. Goldstein had handed me what seems like a hugely constructive tool for taming this impulse. without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So to be able to ask ourselves, is this type of swirl useful? A very practical question to ask. And it comes from a place of mindfulness, paying attention to our own thinking. So he comes back from retreat, and the next chapter is about applying what he learned at the retreat. And he recognized that a very simple way to talk about mindfulness and meditation, or meditation specifically, the meditation activity, was that it was something that made him 10% happier. He thought that people accepted that a lot better than some of the meditation practices, and that people still had associated with, as he said, people wearing robes and listening to John Tesh music, as he said in the video. He talks about the challenges he had getting a new job at the network, and then circling back to meeting Mark Epstein again. They would meet for dinners pretty regularly. They'd get together. Their wives were friends, and he just loved the meetings that he had with Epstein. And they talked about how mindfulness would mitigate problems but not make them go away. He said, I could now see how the mitigation Mark was pitching had real-world consequences. For example, it allowed me to acknowledge my performance issues rather than pretend they didn't exist. And perhaps most important, it made me easier to live with. He said, we live so much of our lives pushed forward by these if only thoughts, if only I had this, if only I could have that, etc. And yet the itch remains. As he put it, the pursuit of happiness becomes the source of our unhappiness. So that's that drive again and not being present. The next chapter talks about how by this point in time, there was all this science being done about the benefits of meditation. And in the video, he had that whole list of medical conditions. He talked about the work being done in corporate settings, which is discussed in this chapter. The additional scientifically validated benefits of meditation discussed in chapter 9 of the book here. And he talks about how the Marine Corps and others were investing in it because of this research. And he talks about his own experience as being really consistent with the research. He said, I noticed myself cultivating a sort of nostalgia for the present, developing the reflex to squelch pointless self-talk and simply notice what was going on around me. And it sounds really obvious, right? But the way he's describing it, I think I could understand. Yeah, I've been there. In moments where I was temporarily able to suspend my monkey mind and simply experience what was going on, I got the smallest taste of the happiness that I'd achieved while I was on the retreat. He talks about some conversations we had with Janice Martirano, who's a corporate attorney at General Mills. You showed in the video, they showed the conference room, somebody wearing a Cheerios shirt. Probably it was at General Mills. And she had brought mindfulness into her organization in a big way because she said it makes you a better leader, more focused, and enhances your creativity and innovation. And the research supported that. She also pointed out that she also pointed out that multitasking is actually impossible. And being more mindful reduces multitasking. We focus on one thing at a time. And meditation helps with that. She also recommended taking what she called purposeful pauses throughout the day. Sounds a little bit like what Eckhart Tolle was talking about, and taking some of these mental breaks, separating ourselves from our thoughts in the interview and the video we saw. And these purposeful pauses help us think more clearly and focus more on what's important. He talks more about some other big corporations, what they were doing in mindfulness in organizations. And by this point, it's become more mainstream. It's being written about in the Wall Street Journal, in the Harvard Business Review, and an article in Wired magazine referred to meditation as the tech world's new caffeine at one point. A couple more chapters in the book that bring it all together. Chapter 10 is called The Self-Interested Case for Not Being a Dick. By the way, this is his language, not mine. And here he talks about interviewing the Dalai Lama. And toward the end of the interview, Harris asked the Dalai Lama a question about compassion. And the Dalai Lama said that there's a selfish reason for being compassionate. He said, the practice of compassion is ultimately a benefit to you. I usually describe it as we are selfish, but be wise selfish rather than foolish selfish. And this was, as Harris describes it, an entirely new spin for me. So he started to practice a metta meditation, METTA, which the meditation people call a loving kindness meditation. We are actually meditating and sending kind thoughts and loving thoughts to certain people in your life. There's different ways to do this. I'm not an expert, by the way, in this. And said that in the months after he started adding compassion to his meditation practice, things started to change. Being nice now became a conscious daily priority. But there was still one piece missing, which I'm just checking the time, which he talks about in the next chapter, the chapter is called Hide the Zen. So he got some advice from Mark Epstein about leading on too much about the Zen side of meditation. And again, through the book, he wrestles with this notion of, yeah, it makes sense to do this, but is it going to take away my competitive edge? Is it going to make me less driven and therefore less successful? Am I going to wind up on a park bench somewhere? Wrestling with the question of how to balance letting go with these personal levels of ambition that he has. During one of his dinners with Epstein, they're talking about this balance between ambition and equanimity, one of the terms that's used to describe this state of letting go. Epstein said, the answer is non-attachment to the results. He said, I think for an ambitious person who cares about their career, who wants to create things and be successful, it's natural to be trying really hard. But then the Buddhist thing comes in around the results, because it doesn't always happen the way you think it should. So Epstein talks about, you write a book, you do everything you can to write a great book, you release the book, and you're not responsible for a lot of things you can't control, like who's going to buy it. And even if you work with great marketing people and you get the materials out, whatever it is, ultimately there's a bunch of things you can't control. And to be non-attached to the things you can't control was a real key for Harris here, which is one of the important takeaways of the book, I think. He said, it really started to click for me. Striving is fine as long as it's tempered by the realization that the final outcome is out of your control. If you don't waste your energy on variables you can't influence, then you can focus much more effectively on those you can. When you're wisely ambitious, you do everything you can to succeed, but you're not attached to the outcome, so that if you fail, you can be maximally resilient, able to get up, dust yourself off, and get back in the fray. And at the end of this chapter, he lays out his list for how to bring all this together. And I'm going to go to that and read some of the highlights here, which he calls the way of the worrier. I think drawing on a notion of the way of the warrior and the way of the worrier. And there's 10 principles here. I'll go over these really quickly. The first is, don't be a jerk. And he describes the virtuous cycle that can happen through kindness and the metta meditation. And yes, sometimes people succeed when being nasty, but it doesn't lead to success in any way. So kind of rule number one is don't be a jerk. Rule number two is when necessary, hide the Zen. Rule number three is meditation, and it talks about briefly about the benefits of meditation. Rule four, the price of security is insecurity until it's not useful. So bringing in that Joseph Goldstein teaching about not ruminating and swirling on what might happen that's negative. Equanimity is not the enemy of creativity. Right? He said, being happier did not, as many fear, make me a blissed out zombie. He said, I found that rather than rendering me boringly problem-free, mindfulness made me, as an eminent spiritual teacher once said, a connoisseur of my neuroses. To be calm and neutral does not mean to be flat or detached from what we're doing. The next rule is don't force it. Embracing ambiguity. Rule 7 is humility prevents humiliation. He said humility was a relief, the opposite of humiliation. It sanded the edges off of the comparing mind. Rule 8 is go easy with the internal cattle prod. Number 9 is non-attachment to results. And number 10 is called What Matters Most. One day I was having brunch with Mark Epstein and Joseph Goldstein, forcing them to help me think about the balance between ambition and equanimity for the umpteenth time. After the entrees and before dessert, Joseph got up to hit the bathroom and he came back smiling and pronounced, "I figured it out. A useful mantra in these moments is what matters most." And this emerged for me as the bottom line gut check precept. When worrying about the future, I learned to ask myself, what do I really want? He said, well, I still love the idea of success. I realized there was only so much suffering I was willing to endure. So those are his rules. And in the very back of the book, well, he writes a bit of a epilogue, and in which he says, and I'll have some good quotes here. The voice in my head is still in many ways an asshole. However, mindfulness now does a pretty good job of tying up the voice and putting duct tape over its mouth. I'm still a maniacally hard worker. I make no apologies for that. I still firmly believe that the price of security is insecurity, that a healthy amount of neuroticism is good. But I also know that widening my circle of concern beyond myself, beyond my own crap, as he says, has made me much happier. Paradoxically, looking inward has made me more outward facing and a much nicer colleague, friend, and husband. And while I still worry about work, learning not to be attached, or he phrased that as care and not care. So not to be attached, to be not attached, at least 10% of the time has freed me up to focus on the parts of my life that matter the most. And in the very back, there's an appendix, which is full of instructions, responses to the top 3 reasons not to meditate, instructions for basic mindfulness and tips, as well as FAQs. He responds to that. And at the very end of the book, there's a small heading that's called In Sum. And he really brings it all together there. And one of my quotes, one of his quotes that I like the most is, under the sway of the ego, life becomes a constant low-grade crisis. You're never sated, never satisfied, always reaching for the next thing like a colicky baby. Meditation is the antidote. It won't fix everything in your life, make you taller, or most likely land you in a state of bliss on a park bench, but it can make you 10% happier and maybe more. So this little book I find to be very, very useful for my clients, and it was for me too, but for my clients who may be very skeptical about meditation, may think it's it has its association, or as Harris writes about, meditation as a big PR problem. Being willing to come along on his journey, taken on a very engaging, cynical, often very funny read, to get to a point to try something. And as he says at the end of the book and at the end of the video we saw as well, if he could do it and get value at it, so could others. And the science now supports that as well. So I encourage you to take a look at this book, 10% Happier. I'm glad to speak with anyone about it if you'd like to, particularly if you want to find ways to apply this or challenged to apply it, because it really can be very helpful in my experience. And it's accessible. This book helps make it accessible, and that's what I appreciate about it. So enjoy the book. And I look forward to some follow-up conversation about this. We'll see you next month.